you can apply it to your painting. Now I'm going to let this area dry. I can't do anything now. The masking is wet, has to dry, and I mean really dry. You don't want to work into that while it's wet because you'll just ruin the entire piece. Now what I think I'll do is I'll start to work on this petal. Remember what I said before. You don't want to paint adjacent petals when one is still wet, because what will happen is the watercolor that you're applying onto the next one will just flow right into there, and you'll get no distinction between petals. But this is nice and dry now, so I can start to fill in the gaps. Prime the area where I intend to add transparent washes of watercolor. Of course, I am looking at my photo. I have it propped up here in the corner. Okay, nice, beautifully damp. Now for my base color, I'm going to apply a wash of quinacridone red. I'll let that set just for a few moments, and then I'm going to apply my alizarin crimson in this area to darken it a bit. Now I'm going to wash in the darker color of crimson, the alizarin crimson, right about there. Move it around a little. But sometimes I want the color to flow. I've made these little cardboard angles that I use for my small watercolors, and they're convenient. They allow me to just place the watercolor in a nice angle. I like what's happening with this area, and I want the watercolor to be more concentrated in that area, that eventually it'll bleed up. Now what's happening though is this is starting to dry. While it's still wet, I want to work in a little bit of the quinacridone magenta. And we'll let that bleed down. We'll control where it goes a bit. So let's assess what we've done so far. We have 3 petals laid in. We started laying in this area and then masked out the small little particles that we painted. And I began to work in the green leaves. What will remain to be done on all of this is to create the veins. Keep in mind, this is the first application of paint. So we do it in sequential steps. First we put in our delicate washes, then on top of that we work in the veins. Having applied my masking material to this area now, I could continue to paint and ignore these little colored areas. So let's do it. Using my number 6 brush, I'm going to dampen the area like I did with the petals. This will control where the paint flows. A nice Napothol red right at the tip. Really strong red. As that sets up a bit, begins to dry, I'm going to add a deeper magenta in this area right over here. And while that's drying, I'm going to add that leaf. Wet the paper. Apply a foundation light wash of my brown matter. Now I'm going to go to that green mixture that you saw me use a little while back. This is a combination of Antwerp blue and Windsor yellow, and I'll flow it into this area. I mixed a little more blue in it this time. I wanted to get a nice deep green. I'm going to let that area dry. While that's dry, and I think I'm going to move it over and show you how I attack veins. I'm looking at my photograph reference, and you can see in the video that I've indicated in my drawing where the vein should go, using ultramarine blue and Aurelian yellow. I'm going to take it, I'm going to wash into the vein area. Notice now the paint. I'm only applying the paint between the two veins, but how do I create the veins? Having done that, I'm going to add plain water to it. The water that I applied will push the pigment towards its dry boundary area, and at that point where the wet meets the dry, I'm going to get a nice fine thin line that will suggest the look of a vein. It's time here to introduce a little of that modulation I was talking about before it gets any drier. I'm going to my magenta and flowing it in. Now, since I have to let this area dry, I could easily go to this petal over here and work in a vein. Now, there are a number of ways I can do that. I mentioned before that this little too much paint on here. I thought it was kind of heavy-handed. I could use that excess paint to my advantage, and here's what I mean. My drawing indicates where the veins need to be. Apply a little bit of clean water in that area, and ever so lightly scrub into it to redissolve the dry watercolor. Then I could add a little bit more water, push the pigment to the edge. Now I have quite a bit of water on that. Can't touch it, have to leave it alone. But the natural process of a drying will result in the formation of a very fine vein-like formation in that area. Jumping down here for a moment, before this gets too dry, I would like to apply a little bit more yellow. So I'm going to take my Winsor yellow, nice clean brush. Always change your rinse water. Nothing like working with dirty water to ruin a watercolor. I'll let that dry. Now what I can do in areas like this, while that area is still relatively wet, I can play around with the color. And I think a little bit stronger yellow would be nice in that. So while it's wet, I'm going to add it. It's going to bleed into what I have. You're not going to see any brush strokes, but you're going to see beautiful combinations of greens. Now I'd like to also create a vein here. You can see what I'm doing. I'm jumping around now, having some fun with it. I still have this to do, but we've actually moved on to the next layer of development in areas like this. And this time, since this is fairly thin, instead of working the paint, re-soften it, I am going to dampen my area. I lift out some of that excess water by squeezing my brush. Or you could use a piece of tissue, squeeze it, and then it's almost like a water vacuum cleaner. It'll suck up excess water. So when I introduce a light wash of red, I think I'll use the Petal red here. When I touch the paper with this red color, I don't want the red color to sink into the paper and suddenly make a brush mark. So by dampening it, I prevent that from happening. See? Now it bleeds. Beautiful. And to create that edge line we're talking about, a few drops of water will push the pigment around in a way that I want. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump around and do this in other areas. Using the same process that you did when you began laying in the petals, avoiding adjacent areas until they're dry, I'm going to do the same thing here. So I would never go to my next section and add that vein. I have to let that dry over here completely before I can do that. Plus this is sopping wet too. Same thing here. This is wet. I can't possibly paint the vein next to it. But I can paint this vein. Got a little bit of my red color. I work it in. I use plain water here. Here I'm using water with a little bit of tint of red. Basically, I'm doing the same thing that I did over here. Now I'll add a drop of water, or two, or three, and let it dry. The watercolor's nice and dry now, and I can continue work. The areas that I started to develop the veins are beginning to look good. Now I have to continue that process, and you know what the process is now. Either I wet an area, work into the paint to re-dissolve it, and then add some additional water and allow the water to push the pigment towards the edge, creating the line, the vein. In this case, and in this case, I applied a wash of red, the Petal red or quinacridone red, and added the additional water and allowed that water to push the newly applied transparent wash to the edge. And you also saw me use the same method in the leaves that I used in the petals to create the veins. But before I go any further, what I would like to do is apply more masking to this area. I masked out these areas and the filaments after I had painted them in. Now the masking material is dry. Then I flowed in this color here. Now that's very dry. I also went over it with a hairdryer to ensure it's dry. Now I'll apply a nice fluid wash of masking material to protect that area. Notice how I do that? I don't brush it on. I flow it on. I use quite a bit of masking material. Brushing it on, you run the risk of lifting up the paint underneath. But if you use enough quantity and you flow it on like this, it's easy to spread the material. But remember to practice working with masking on a scrap piece of paper that you added some watercolor to before you actually attack your work with it. If you do it wrong, you can ruin your work. When that is dry, then I can continue adding these petals over here, totally ignoring what's under the masking material, because now what's under the masking material is protected by the masking material. What I like to do is continue to create the vein effect by washing in some transparent layers of color. I'm going to work in some Napothal red and then spread it with plain water. This is the area that I think is just a little too heavy, so I'm going to wet it. And then scrub into it a bit, lifting out some of that color. Then flowing clean water into it and allowing the color to be pushed to the edge. That'll create a vein. And if I feel there's too much color, I could always suck some up. And this is how I do it. I clean my brush, get off the excess, and then work right into there. Always wiping the brush onto a tissue to get rid of the excess. See? I lift some of that color out. Now I'm going to add a little bit of clean water. I'm at that point where I have to leave it alone again. I can't work in any of these areas. Too much water, too much potential for disaster. I'm going to add another vein over here. I can't work in this area, but I can certainly do some more work down here. So I'm going to go to my mixture of Antwerp blue and Aurelin yellow and mix a nice green. I'm gonna add that wash right here. I'm going to have to eventually adjust this to agree with that. But in the interim, I'm going to add this one too. That I just mixed is actually closer to what's in the photograph. I wouldn't mind working in a vein over here. And this looks like it needs to be wet a bit. And I need to lift the color out. Lifting color out is as important as applying color. Remember, effective watercolor painting is not all about brushing color on paper. It's about the way you manipulate the color and allow it to be its own natural self. Making progress here. That definitely is not working though. But I'll show you how to fix it. No big deal. I'm going to lift some color out over here. I wet it, then I add in additional water that will push the pigment to the edge, and I lift out the water by dragging my brush down the center. Why do I do all that? Because it actually does force pigment to precipitate down along that edge line that I drew, indicating the veins. And I could lighten the center by lifting up excess water and subtracting a little bit of pigment from that area. The watercolor is thoroughly dry, so I could continue to work into it. But now what I really want to tackle are these areas right here. The masking material is completely dry, so I can paint over it, ignoring what's underneath. I flowed color in this area because it's thoroughly protected by the masking material now. I did it the way you saw me, apply color to all the other petals. And I've been filling in adjacent areas where veins are indicated, veins in the petal that we see in the subject matter. As long as the adjacent areas are completely dry, I can flow in a color and I'll get that line, that beautiful, delicate, gossamer thin line that indicates the vein. So the process is an application of a wash. You allow the wash to dry, then you can wash over the wash with another wash of color, enriching the painting as you move along. I'm in the process of working around the entire watercolor and touching up areas and establishing the veins. final petal. Everything next to it is dry. So I'll be able to lay in this wash, get a nice edge line without it running into adjacent areas. Notice I indicated in the drawing folds in the petal. I've been ignoring that. That's a detail that I can take care of later. I have three variations on red. I laid in the wash of quinacridone red. Then on top of that, I flowed my magenta to get the darker area, and now I'm adding a little alizarin crimson. Good. I let it stand for a while so it would dry. Now I'm going to continue to develop it overall. I'm not going to say much because I think you understand what I'm doing. I'm going to continue to develop the veins in the petals.